Professor Boaz Ganor, participants, distinguished audience, I would like to congratulate you all after my polite colleague, Mr. Yaakov Perry. And as said Mr. Yaakov Perry, and it said here that there is a risk of the rehabilitation of Hezbollah and Hamas after the nuclear agreement and what is happening to the world with ISIS in the background. So I chose to expand on this topic, which I believe is very important, and that is the topic of rehabilitation. What is the risk embedded in rehabilitation of any terror organization? In Iran and Hezbollah is one singular issue, especially vis-a-vis terror, because they want to come and eradicate your culture, and in the case of Israel, they want to do so finally and totally. In a war and counter-terrorism, there are two main issues that are crucial. First of all, you have to understand the severity of the threat, and secondly, moral clarity. Both of them are prerequisites for the determination of any public in their battle if you want to mobilize them in a long-term battle against terror and stabilization. So in other words, that you have to very clearly state who is the good and who is the evil, so that all of us will be ready to be mobilized. Everyone will be ready even to pay a price in such a long-winded battle. What is the risk of rehabilitation? It blurs the risk, it blurs the threat, and it also gnaws away at that sense of justice in the battle against terror, in the determination, in the capability of captivating the hearts of the public in order to mobilize them to fight against terror. When you sign an agreement with someone who sees your destruction as their victory, it is as if a civilized person is on the same status as someone who is totally not civilized and believes in your destruction. You, by actually publicly shaking his hand, are threatening the tangible, immediate threat and also the long-term threat, because you are being photographed in order to justify that agreement, and even the words of leaders following that agreement, in order to blur that long-term threat, in order to justify it politically. All those gnaw at the public's capability of fighting terror in on the long term. Now, the legitimacy of Islamic world terror did not just start when it was signed. It started a number of years before that, with an enormous acceleration and a quantum leap that was taken, and it was then signed in 2009. And this reflected a far-fetching change in the American policy, showing how they wanted to approximate themselves and come closer to the Muslim people. These are our brethren, the Muslim Brotherhood. They sat in those rows of the distinguished guests in the audience. Mubarak was not there. And then there was support of the Muslim Brotherhood with the Arab Spring. Mubarak, who for many years had previously been in very close contact with, but he was not there. And those Muslim Brotherhood sees the swap of the our governments with Islam governments as their main aim. I mean, if you can say, you know, as this authority, the sort of the most sort of premium authority of the Muslim Brotherhood envisions Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as a very close friend of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. And let us not forget that the majority of the Muslim terror organizations of the world actually are inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood. And I am stressing this point because the motivational force of terror is ideology. Before anything else, it is primarily that. The idea is an elevated idea that people are willing to risk their lives for, even to commit suicide. That is a premium force in the history of mankind, that kind of motivation. For terror, like in any other terror organization, beyond its terror, it also has various means and tools. It has leadership that promotes its beliefs, and it has the weaponry in accordance. It has the various arms. It might have a financial arm, an educational arm. It might even have charity organizations, students organizations, and they've got a manning organization and human resources and everything in order to mobilize people from wherever possible to join their ranks. And of course, distribution, marketing. ISIS, for example, with the help of 3 meters of orange material and a beheading in public, they succeed in mobilizing thousands of people from various countries around the world. And if you enumerate all those organizations that have identified with ISIS and the Muslim Caliphate and have envisioned in Baghdadi as their leader, they have seen him as such, not only in Syria, Iraq, Sinai, in the Golan Heights, Africa, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Believe me, that list is yet very long. This is a world phenomenon. It's not limited to Iraq and Syria that we are reading, but the great evil is the United States. We are the lesser devil, the lesser Satan, but Israel is also considered that. And so the whole secular West, the humanistic one, when it sees and envisions this phenomenon, it realizes that they do not only need to fight it in military with tools, but on ideology, in finance, in education. They need on every level and tier and layer to fight them. I believe that, but they are losing ideologically over the last few years, and I think that the organization, I think that the West, in fact, have actually, trying to be so politically correct, have lost out on so much. Even if this was supposed to be a discourse about the rights of human beings, but unfortunately there isn't sufficient discourse about them in the various countries. But here in the Western countries, the people only mobilize when there is a tangible, dramatic threat that is immediate to us. And even then, when the war takes longer and the casualties and fatalities are increased, then they feel it's a kind of war attrition on the public. They tire. So even President Bush, when he attacked Afghanistan after the Twin Tower, he could then, in September 2011, but unfortunately, the threat has not been removed. And there are so many in the leadership of the West. Even if they do fully understand this threat, it is so difficult to lead society that is captivated to a different agenda. The public is exhausted, they are drained, and they find it very difficult to even find the energy to impact and influence the politicians. And the Islamism, and I'm saying Islamism, I'm not saying Islam, I'm talking about very smaller, a fraction of this radical Islam. It is permeating Europe. Yes, the numbers are increasing, but with that there are more and more Islamists. Their numbers are increasing, and if you look at what is happening in Europe, you can see it. Thousands of those mosques in Europe are financed by jihadists and so many other extremists. So people are talking about actually exchanging the regimes and they say that these are values and their belief in God and the belief in the family and various virtues and values, and they're talking about it as if it is a justifiable objective, and they're talking about certain areas now in for example, neighborhoods in England that are no-go zones. The entrance from this moment on, the Sharia law are being enforced from this point onwards. Europe is fighting for its identity for the last few years. Just less than 10 years ago, Mrs. Giselle Littman from Great Britain published the book and said that America stands alone because Europe is falling. Only United States, and if you look at the evidence of the process that is undergoing Europe, then you should read Michel Moulvec, that was translated recently into Hebrew, and you can see the process in France, how people in its national security services, in its academic elite ranks, are slowly but surely falling into that worldview, wherein he writes that since 2002, you can see how these numbers and the whole situation is escalating, and Europe is losing its actual previous identity. This is a struggle for identity. There were various things that happened amongst the leaders of Europe during this process. Angela Merkel, over 5 years ago in 2010, spoke about multiculturalism and journey having failed totally. And 6 months later, David Cameron in Great Britain also said that this is a war on multiculturalism in England. But for the person who first spoke about Islamism was Tony Blair when he was prime minister, when he was no longer prime minister, and he spoke about defining the challenge of our time and explained it exactly as it is. And we do need to do so as a prerequisite to explain and to show the public the order of magnitude of this threat in order to mobilize the public for the struggle against fanaticism and against terror. It's very difficult for me to see the leader of the free world avoiding a definition clearly of the problem. Yes, the heads of the administration are not allowed to use those terms, radical Islam, Islamism. Only a few weeks ago, at a memorial to the 5 Marine soldiers who were killed in Chattanooga, the President and Ashton Carter said, the Secretary of State, that he's saying it in English.
Violent extremism and hateful ideology was at work. We don't know.
I think that we do know. We do know. And the time has come Time is of the essence to say this to the public, because Europe is capable of doing a great deal, but it is not doing sufficiently. And we're talking about Iraq and Syria and terror around the world. And we have seen attacks from the air, and we have seen targeted killings, but we have not seen determination and perseverance in grappling with the problem with its entire scope. Something else we've seen in Europe, and that is the joining of various coalitions that exist over the last year. For example, in Syria, I must admit that in Europe, after Charlie Hebdo, that horrific slaughter there last winter, I read it but thought about it with disappointment, because it's not a problem to go and buy a warm coat and a scarf and good shoes to go out to a demonstration, but it is just a demonstration of weakness. How long have I got left? Unfortunately, he was told to keep things brief. I'm just going to conclude by saying that in order to summarize the issue of rehabilitation, there is, in order to motivate people, you need ideology. The jihad idea is the one that impacts people and challenges civilization, the Jewish and Christian one. In order to really defeat it, you need to battle it on every front. So if you're talking about the signing of the last agreement with Iran, in Israel, the whole free world, but most specifically us, this has created a very harsh problem. Most specifically because not only do we have a lack of readiness to be able to face it and counter this problem, so with your permission, 2 more minutes vis-à-vis Daesh, ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Iran has various layers of freedom in that agreement. In addition to the legitimization, they've got $150 million. Sorry, $1 billion. I'm correcting myself. He says that they'll be able to use force for terror by proxy, even in Lebanon and in Syria. They have a deep interest in seeing Iran as a stable country in Europe. They have a political and military interest, just as America has. They want to see Iran fighting ISIS. It'll save boots on the ground. Someone else will do the work. And in ISIS, for some reason, they see their main threat there in Europe as their greatest threat, in the light of all those refugee waves that they see being accepted into Europe. But they are fighting for life and death. It's as if it is their continued war since the days of the 8th century repeating themselves. And thus, and with the Sunnis as well, and with the short-term collaboration with the Sunnis against Daesh, we can see the shifting sands here in the Middle East. The crucial vested interest of Iran is to leave Iraq, Syria, Lebanon under their influence, and long-term, when there is no longer the strife with the Hezbollah, they will then draw their attention to their next foe. Perhaps it'll be Israel then. But at the moment, they cannot allow themselves to open up a new front with Israel, because if Israel fights back, it will definitely be a decisive campaign against their fate, the Hezbollah's fate in Iran and Lebanon, because not only are they serving Iran and in Syria and Assad's regime in Lebanon, but they are fighting for their long-term fate. So if the Sunnis win, then the Shiites' destiny will definitely be decided. I would like to thank you, and just to say one thing with our hearts as we go ahead. Let's think about this. What happened to the rehabilitation that we in Israel wanted to award to the terror we are fighting? That's the Palestinian terror. But that I will only be able to expand on if I'm given an additional 10 minutes.